Mirrors were liars, but Natasha Lytess wielded them like weapons. On that autumn night in 1948, in the small rehearsal room on the third floor of Columbia Pictures' practice building, Norma Jeane Dougherty watched herself from 12 different angles. Lytess had positioned the lights with surgical precision, soft, harsh, side lighting, illumination from above. "Now speak," she commanded. Norma Jeane spoke. "No, that's Norma Jeane's voice. Again." Hours passed. Norma Jeane repeated the same sentence each time, and each time Lytess said no. By the eighth hour, the young woman's voice began to break, but it broke differently. Breathy, soft, vulnerable, yet somehow inviting. "Stop," Lytess said. "That's it. Remember that." That night, when Norma Jeane went to Lytess's home and looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. It wasn't just her hair or makeup, her face, her expression, her gaze belonged to someone else. "Norma Jeane is dead," Lytess whispered behind her. "Marilyn is being born." And from that moment forward, the world would know Marilyn Monroe. But no one would ever know what Norma Jeane left behind in that mirror room. Before we continue with this story, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the hidden scandals and untold truths about Hollywood's golden age icons. Columbia Pictures in 1948 wasn't MGM's glamour factory or Paramount's prestige palace. It was a scrappy studio run by Harry Cohn, a man known for his volcanic temper and his ability to spot money-making talent. But even Cohn had his blind spots, and in the spring of 1948, one of those blind spots was a brown-haired contract player named Norma Jeane Dougherty. She'd been bouncing around the studio system for 2 years, picking up tiny roles that led nowhere. The camera didn't love her the way it should have. Her voice was ordinary, almost nasal. Her movements were stiff, self-conscious. Studio executives who watched her screen tests would shuffle papers, check their watches, move on to the next hopeful. Norma Jeane was drowning in mediocrity, and she knew it. But Natasha Lytess saw something different. Lytess was a Russian-born acting coach with theatrical training from the old world, a woman who'd fled the Moscow Art Theater during the Revolution and rebuilt her life teaching the craft she'd learned from masters most Hollywood people had never heard of. She had worked with Max Reinhardt in Berlin, absorbed the techniques that would later influence method acting. Harry Cohn had hired her because she could occasionally fix broken performances, polish rough diamonds just enough to make them marketable. He didn't understand her methods and didn't particularly care to, as long as she delivered results on schedule and under budget. The first real session between Lytess and Norma Jeane happened in May 1948 in that third-floor rehearsal room that would become their laboratory. Studio records show it was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 7. Lytess didn't start with scripts or scenes. She started with breathing. She had Norma Jeane stand in front of those mirrors, watching herself breathe for 45 minutes, just breathing. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, watching how the shoulders moved, how the chest rose and fell, how the face changed with each breath. Norma Jeane thought it was ridiculous, but Lytess was patient in a way that bordered on obsessive. "You breathe like you're apologizing," Lytess told her. "Every breath you take says, 'I'm sorry I'm here. I'm sorry I'm taking up space. I'm sorry you have to look at me. We're going to change that.'" And they did. Over the following weeks, Lytess taught Norma Jeane to breathe from her diaphragm, to let each breath become visible, audible, present, because breath controls voice, and voice carries emotion, and emotion creates connection. When Norma Jeane learned to breathe with purpose, her entire physical presence began to shift. Her shoulders dropped, her spine lengthened, her face relaxed into expressions that looked natural instead of forced. Directors who'd ignored her for 2 years started calling her back for second readings, but breathing was just the foundation. What Lytess did with Norma Jeane's voice over those early months was nothing short of acoustic engineering. She recorded every session on a wire recorder that Columbia had purchased for dialogue coaching. Those recordings still exist in the studio archives, and they tell a remarkable story. In the earliest recordings from May 1948, you can hear Norma Jeane's natural speaking voice, slightly nasal, with a California accent, nothing particularly memorable. By August, 3 months into intensive work with Lytess, the voice had begun to change. The pitch had dropped slightly, the pace had slowed, and there was something else, something that would become Marilyn Monroe's signature, breath woven through the words. Lytess had discovered something crucial about sound and sexuality. When a voice carries audible breath, when you can hear the mechanics of speaking, it creates an intimacy, a sense that the speaker is vulnerable, unguarded, letting you hear not just words, but the body producing those words. It's a technique that singers use, that radio announcers in the 1940s sometimes employed, but no one in Hollywood had systematically applied it to create a screen persona. Lytess did. She had Norma Jeane practice speaking with different breath placements, breath before words, breath between words, breath integrated into the words themselves. They worked with phrases that became exercises. Hello, how are you? Spoken 100 different ways, each variation recorded, analyzed, perfected. Eventually, they found it, that perfect balance where the breath enhanced the words without overwhelming them, where vulnerability and strength coexisted in the same syllable. The third-floor rehearsal room became known among Columbia staff as the Mirror Room, though officially it was just Studio C. Lytess had transformed it into something between a dance studio and a psychological laboratory. Mirrors covered 3 walls completely. The fourth wall was bare and painted flat gray. The lighting rig was custom-built to Lytess's specifications, 12 different light sources that could be controlled independently. Most crucially, there was a camera on a tripod in the corner, loaded with film that Lytess paid for out of her own pocket because Columbia wouldn't authorize the expense. She filmed everything. The work they did in that room went far beyond traditional acting coaching. Lytess was interested in what she called physical vocabulary, the unconscious movements and gestures that communicate before words ever arrive. She had Norma Jeane walk across the room hundreds of times while cameras rolled and mirrors reflected. Walk naturally, walk like you're confident, walk like you're scared, walk like everyone's watching and you love it. Each walk was different, and Lytess would stop the young actress, analyze what worked and what didn't. A slight sway in the hips conveyed confidence, but too much looked vulgar. Eye contact held for 3 seconds created connection, held for 5 seconds became aggressive. They worked on smiles. Not just one smile, but a repertoire of smiles for different emotional contexts. The genuine smile that crinkled the eyes. The mysterious smile that held back secrets. The little girl smile that was pure and unguarded. The knowing smile that suggested shared conspiracies. Lytess cataloged them all, gave them names, taught Norma Jeane to access them on command. Years later, photographers would marvel at how Marilyn Monroe could shift between different expressions in the space between frames. It wasn't instinct. It was Lytess's mirror room training, exercises repeated so many times they became muscle memory. But there was a darker side to this transformation. To create Marilyn Monroe, Lytess had to systematically dismantle Norma Jeane, not just teach her new skills, but convince her that her old self was inadequate, unmarketable, wrong. In the transcripts of their sessions, you can trace this psychological dismantling. That laugh sounds cheap, Lytess would say. Don't move your hands like that. It's common. Your natural speaking voice is too plain, too forgettable. Each criticism was surgical, specific, devastating. Lytess wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. She genuinely believed this was necessary, that to build something new you had to clear away the old completely. Norma Jeane began having nightmares. She'd wake up and wouldn't know which person she was supposed to be. In the mirror, she'd see a stranger. Her own reflection had become unfamiliar because every gesture, every expression, every movement had been analyzed and reconstructed. In therapy sessions years later, Marilyn Monroe would talk about this period as a kind of death, the murder of her original self. By the fall of 1948, Lytess believed Norma Jeane was ready for a proper showcase. She requested a meeting with Harry Cohn to demonstrate what she'd accomplished. Cohn was skeptical. He'd seen Norma Jeane's screen tests, had approved her contract renewal more out of inertia than enthusiasm. He showed up at the Mirror Room on a Thursday afternoon with two associates, expecting to spend 15 minutes watching another forgettable starlet stumble through a scene. What he saw shocked him into silence. Norma Jeane, now using the name Marilyn Monroe for the first time in a professional context, performed a scene from a play Lytess had chosen specifically for this demonstration. Marilyn entered the room as if she owned it, moved through the space with a languid confidence that seemed both natural and calculated. Her voice had that new breathy quality, deployed sparingly, strategically. When she laughed, the sound seemed to illuminate the room. When she turned to look directly at the camera, it felt like she was looking into your soul. The scene lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, Harry Cohn stood up without saying a word, walked to the window, looked out at the Columbia lot for a long moment. Finally, he turned around and looked at Lytess. "What the hell did you do to her?" It wasn't really a question, it was acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. Cohn greenlit Ladies of the Chorus, authorized a pay increase for Lytess, and gave her unprecedented access to rehearsal time and studio resources. As Monroe's career began to accelerate through 1949 and into 1950, a pattern established itself that would define their relationship for the next 6 years. Monroe insisted that Lytess be present on every set, for every scene she filmed. Directors learned to work around Lytess's presence. Before each take, Monroe would glance at her coach, standing just off camera. Lytess would give small signals, a nod, a hand gesture, sometimes just a change in her facial expression. Only after receiving this approval would Monroe commit fully to the scene. This dependency drove some directors crazy. They felt undermined, as if they weren't really directing Monroe, but simply executing choices that Lytess had already made in private rehearsals. Other directors learned to use it, conferring with Lytess before scenes, incorporating her suggestions. Studio executives watched this dynamic with mixed feelings. Monroe was becoming increasingly valuable, but they were essentially employing two people to get one performance. In 1952, Monroe met Joe DiMaggio, the retired baseball legend who was immediately smitten with Hollywood's rising star. But behind the scenes, a tension developed. DiMaggio couldn't understand Monroe's attachment to Lytess. He saw it as unprofessional, possibly unhealthy. Why did his girlfriend need this intense Russian woman's approval for everything? He began to resent Lytess's presence, to view her as a rival for Monroe's attention. Lytess, for her part, made little effort to hide her displeasure with DiMaggio. She thought he was intellectually beneath Monroe, incapable of appreciating the artistry they'd worked so hard to develop. She worried that marriage to DiMaggio would pull Monroe away from Hollywood, from their work together. Monroe was caught between them, trying to maintain both relationships. In interviews years later, Monroe would say about Lytess, "She was wonderful to me, but she was very jealous of the men I saw. She acted like a jealous husband." Between 1948 and 1954, Natasha Lytess worked with Marilyn Monroe on more than 20 films. In the credits, she was usually listed as drama coach, or sometimes not listed at all. But on set, everyone knew her role was far more significant. She'd arrive before Monroe, confer with directors about the day's scenes, sometimes suggest camera angles or blocking. During takes, she stood next to the camera, her face visible to Monroe, providing real-time feedback through subtle expressions. Between takes, they'd huddle together, dissecting what worked and what didn't. Directors had mixed reactions. Some found Lytess's presence irritating but useful. Howard Hawks reportedly said, "I didn't like having to direct through an intermediary, but I couldn't argue with the results." Marilyn with Natasha was better than Marilyn without her. The tension was always present. Who was really directing Marilyn Monroe? In 1955, everything changed. Monroe traveled to New York and enrolled at the Actors Studio, studying under Lee Strasberg and his wife Paula. The Strasberg method was different from everything Lytess had taught, more internal, more focused on emotional memory. Monroe was enthralled. Here was a prestigious institution validating her desire to be taken seriously as an artist. For Lytess, Monroe's enthusiasm for the Strasbergs was devastating. It wasn't just professional rejection, it felt personal, as if the 8 years they'd spent together suddenly meant nothing. Lytess tried to maintain her position, but Monroe was already pulling away, referring to Lee Strasberg as her artistic father, allowing Paula Strasberg to take over the coaching role on film sets. In 1956, while Monroe was in England filming The Prince and the Showgirl, Lytess received a telegram. It was brief, formal, devastating. Her services were no longer required. Monroe had decided to work exclusively with Paula Strasberg going forward. There was no personal conversation, no explanation beyond the professional formality of the telegram. After 8 years of daily collaboration, their relationship ended with a piece of paper delivered by a messenger. Lytess was destroyed. She'd built her professional reputation on her work with Monroe. More than that, her entire life had revolved around the project of creating Marilyn Monroe. Studio work dried up, her savings dwindled, friends reported that she became increasingly isolated, bitter, unable to move past the rejection. In the years after their split, as Monroe's fame reached its peak, the question of credit became increasingly important to Lytess. She gave interviews explaining the work they'd done together, the transformation she'd engineered. But the public narrative had already shifted. Paula Strasberg was the coach everyone saw on Monroe's later film sets. The name Natasha Lytess appeared in footnotes, if at all. The truth was more complex. The Marilyn Monroe who studied at the Actors Studio existed because of foundations Natasha Lytess had built. The breathy voice, the distinctive walk, the ability to project vulnerability and sexuality simultaneously, these weren't method acting techniques. These were precisely engineered performance choices that Lytess had developed through years of technical work. Paula Strasberg helped Monroe access emotional truth, but she was working with an instrument that Lytess had already tuned. After 1956, Natasha Lytess essentially disappeared from Hollywood. She took occasional coaching jobs, worked briefly at a small theater company, tried to write a book about her experiences that no publisher would touch. Financial problems mounted. Health issues emerged, stress and disappointment taking their toll. In 1963, just a year after Marilyn Monroe's death, Natasha Lytess died of cancer. She was 64 years old. The obituaries were brief, most noting her primarily as Marilyn Monroe's early acting coach. There was no recognition of the artistry involved in what she'd accomplished. Lytess died knowing that history would remember Marilyn Monroe but forget Natasha Lytess, that all her work would be reduced to a footnote. Today, researchers with access to Columbia Pictures archives can piece together the full story. The wire recordings of those early sessions exist, hundreds of hours documenting the transformation. The film footage Lytess shot in the mirror room survived. Studio memos detail the unusual arrangement. Lytess's own notes provide technical details about the work, vocal exercises, movement drills, psychological approaches. What emerges is a portrait of genuine artistic collaboration and troubling psychological enmeshment. Lytess gave Monroe tools that made her stardom possible, but she also created a dependency that haunted Monroe for the rest of her life. The inability to perform without approval, the need for constant reassurance, these anxieties had their roots in the mirror room where Natasha Lytess had systematically dismantled Norma Jeane to build Marilyn. In Monroe's final years, as her career faltered and personal demons intensified, observers noted patterns that echoed her time with Lytess: the inability to make decisions without extensive consultation, the need for constant validation, The paralysis when asked to perform without the right support system. Paula Strasberg had become the new Lytess, providing the approval Monroe needed, but the underlying psychology hadn't changed. Monroe had learned in that mirror room that her natural self was inadequate, that she needed expert guidance to become acceptable. How do you undo a transformation that happened at such a deep level? Norma Jeane had died in that mirror room in 1948, and Marilyn Monroe carried that death inside her. The price of becoming an icon was losing the person she'd been. Looking back with 75 years of perspective, the Lytess Monroe story is tragic on multiple levels. Lytess created something extraordinary and received neither recognition nor reward, dying bitter and forgotten. Monroe achieved global fame, but lost herself in the process. The project that consumed both their lives succeeded beyond anyone's imagination, but destroyed both women involved. There's a broader lesson here about Hollywood's machinery. Lytess was a genuine artist, a technical innovator who understood performance at a level few coaches ever reach. Monroe was a vulnerable young woman with real talent and crushing insecurities. Their collaboration should have been celebrated as a partnership. Instead, it became exploitation and dependency, control and resentment, ultimately abandonment and bitterness. What Natasha Lytess proved, though she never received credit for the proof, is that star quality isn't entirely innate. It can be taught, built, engineered through systematic application of technical principles. The breathless voice, the distinctive walk, the unique screen presence that made Marilyn Monroe unforgettable, these weren't accidents. They were precisely calculated performance choices, developed through years of obsessive work. Lytess demonstrated that with the right subject, enough time, and sufficient expertise, you can manufacture an icon. But her story also reveals the costs of this manufacturing process. Monroe never escaped the need for external validation that Lytess's methods created. The confident persona that audiences saw masked profound insecurity, a woman who'd been taught so thoroughly that her natural self was inadequate, that she never fully trusted her own instincts again. The tragedy isn't just that Lytess died forgotten. The deeper tragedy is that her greatest creation was also her victim, someone whose success came at the price of losing herself. And so the mirror room story ends where it began, with mirrors that lie, with reflections that show what we're taught to see rather than what actually exists, with the question of whether Marilyn Monroe was a triumph of artistic creation or a cautionary tale about the human costs of manufactured fame. Perhaps it's a question that can't be resolved, only examined and carried forward as a reminder that every icon we celebrate contains hidden stories of the people who built them. The legacy lives on in every actress who understands that presence is built, not born, and in the forgotten name of the woman who proved it was possible.